Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. This week, we're kicking off our Jesus Loafs You, aka Bread of Life, series. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Pete. My pronouns are he, him.
Today, we kick off our Jesus Loafs You series with our A-Bun-Dance episode. In this episode, we'll discuss the ninth Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 17 or Proper 12, which this year falls on July 25th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Today, to kick off our Jesus Loafs You series, we have Pete Myers, aka Protest P, who is a writer, community activist, and organizer with the North Des Moines Mutual Aid project. He also serves as the editor-in-chief of the Des Moines Defender community zine.
Welcome, Pete.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure getting to know you too, and I appreciate the platform here. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hoping to learn a lot.
Awesome. Us too. So this is our first episode in our Jesus Loafs You series. In this series, so for the next about 5 weeks in worship, folks will read a lot about Jesus as the bread of life. And so the series that we're doing begins with 2 different stories. One of the prophet Elisha and one of Jesus and the disciples via a child feeding large crowds, which is a lot of what mutual aid groups have been doing for years, but especially during this pandemic. So I'm curious, what inspired you to be part of this work of feeding your community?
Yeah, good question. We were really inspired by the 2020 uprising in the BLM coalition and some of the leadership in those organizations, learning from them, learning about some of the history of mutual aid programs and communities such as the Black Panthers, and trying to kind of mimic the positive things that came out of some of those community food programs. And we've found on a small scale that we're able to accumulate enough donations in overflow to show that food isn't really something that needs to be commoditized on a small scale. But we're motivated by the leadership that already exists in town and some of the things we've learned from them and our predecessors. There's also 2 existing mutual aid groups that came before us in mutual aid that we work closely with that also motivated us, and the Griffin Mutual Aid and Des Moines Mutual Aid are both close friends of ours. We work together with them as well.
Nice. Mutual aid groups working mutually to aid. So as you mentioned, the North Des Moines Mutual Aid got started during the pandemic. I'm curious how you in particular got involved with them.
Sure. It was a matter of consistently showing up to street movements and direct actions and even just, community meetings and networking, making friends. The entire thing last summer changed my life. It took it in an entirely new direction. I have a completely new circle of people and completely new set of objectives compared to where I was 18 months ago. And that, again, thanks to the community that exists here in Des Moines. But I got involved with it, kind of like I said, just networking with an immediate group of friends that I met at protests and sitting around last winter, being antsy, looking for something to do. And one of the leaders of North Des Moines Mutual Aid threw out the idea of mimicking a free breakfast program in a certain neighborhood. And we all ran with it. It's been great. It's very easy to organize a small mutual aid project like that when you have, just 5 or 6 like-minded people that are all on the same page and work together seamlessly. It's been a lot of work, but not terribly challenging to be consistent. Even with that, the minimal resources we have, we simply pool them and give them away in abundance, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So your mutual aid group is currently focused on providing a free breakfast, but I believe you're also planning to branch out into other needs in your community. Could you tell us about 1 or 2 things that you'd like to branch out to cover as well?
No doubt. Yeah, we already have, honestly, not to brag, but yeah, we almost immediately spurred a community fridge program off the free breakfast. I'd say about 2 months afterwards. A little bit of construction time involved there, obviously. Mm-hmm. I'm speaking on behalf of the fridge. I didn't do the immediate labor. I'm an unconditional supporter of them. But yeah, that was, again, motivated by witnessing immediate need in the Merle Hay community. That's where I've lived for the past 9 years. If you look around and you talk to enough of your neighbors and spend enough time walking the streets and the sidewalks, you'll see that there's kind of an invisible homeless problem in that area, which the city prefers to sweep under the rug and pretend doesn't exist. Whereas the group that I'm working with is looking to confront it head on first through addressing food insecurity and giving people in that immediate area access to free meat fresh groceries and kind of a community pantry / meeting point where, there's no need to feel ashamed that you're in need. Like both of you have said, we're coming out of a, global pandemic with record food insecurity and unemployment. So we're going to see these issues come up more and more. And if you're not seeing it in your neighborhood now, you will soon. But where I live, we're seeing it. And just a very, very small thing we can do is to give away food. It's really as simple as that, feeling like you're doing the right thing and redistributing wealth per se.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, your language choice. And I have heard different ways of framing it, right? So there is a homelessness problem. It is a problem that our community creates situations where people are homeless, not by choice, but forced to be homeless. And it reminds me of the war on drugs and the war on poverty, where those ended up actually being wars on people living in situations of poverty and wars on people with substance abuse, addiction, illnesses. And so I think the experience I've had over the last year has been that this homelessness problem, or the war on homelessness, has been by the city a lot of evicting people from houseless camps and those sorts of things. And so there's this sense of the problem is that we're allowing homelessness to continue, not that people are homeless per se. Like the people are not the problem. They're people and humans who have a right to exist. Yeah.
Finland recently fixed homelessness by giving people homes. Funny how that works.
Weird. Utah did that too. And there's bugs that need worked out, but
sure,
we have the capacity, right?
And it does such good things for the community when you do that.
That is definitely the solution, is to give houses people, simply give them homes. There are more empty buildings in this country than there are houses people. So the resources already exist. The choice isn't to become houseless, it's to not fix houselessness. That's what is a choice.
Yeah. One way that I've heard of the establishment causing trouble for groups like yours, Pete, is that the laws about food safety are brought down like a hammer on them. And those laws exist for a reason, because food safety is important. We've learned a lot about that in the last, say, 100 years. And also, the funny thing about people who want to feed people is that, pretty universally, they want to feed people and not poison them at the same time. So I'm on board with that too. But can you talk a little bit about how the establishment, and I'm not necessarily just talking about the government, but also people of a certain mindset who don't want programs like yours in their backyard, about how they use rules that exist for good reason to hamstring efforts to help people?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we have to be conscious of and are conscious of. Without delegitimizing that argument, kind of like you set me up there, we're obviously not in the interest of giving out bad food for free to our customers. Obviously, the people that will criticize us like that, there are so many of them, and that's such the prevalent mentality in neoliberal capitalism that we'll get drowned if we try to address every single one of those concerns. And that's a good one, but that is one of dozens and dozens of nitpick things that people can use against us while arguing through the lens of legality, which we're not concerned about. We believe that any law that says it's illegal to give away food is unjust. So if we're breaking the law, then so be it.
And it turns out that the question between legal and illegal versus the question between what is the right good thing to do and what is the wrong bad thing to do is a little more complicated than some people are willing to put the effort into.
Totally.
Saying whether something is legal or illegal, well, okay, lawyers are going to jump down my throat if I say that's a simple delineation to make. Sometimes that is complicated, fine, and we have professionals for that. But the line between what is good or what is not necessarily whether or not it's legal. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's the right choice.
Yeah, and
exactly.
We have a lot of examples in scripture too, as Christians, of Shiphrah and Puah, who are midwives without whom Moses would not exist. And it is because they recognized that the law that was supposed to tell them to kill Moses and young baby boys especially was unjust. It was an immoral law. So while they did something illegal, they went against that law, they also were doing something moral and just and based in justice. And they were not the only midwives who did that. There were a lot of midwives in the time who were doing that.
Yeah.
But that's one of those examples where I think a lot of particularly conservative Christian evangelicalism, it just kind of glosses over that. And it has been co-opted so much into the painting the brush of Christianity on top of conservative politics that it's just repeating the, oh, it's illegal, therefore it's wrong, versus what is the moral thing to do? And does that line up with the law, or is the law unjust? And how do we engage with that?
Yeah.
Sure. And definitely just to qualify what our actions with that program in the fridge, we know we're kind of pushing the envelope, but in no way are these actual revolutionary programs that would really push the bounds of the law, ironically, because they are. The city has reacted to the fridge for the time being. But both things that we're doing are very basic, designed to fit a very small need with hopes that they would be replicated by other people in the community that may be like-minded and want to run something like that themselves. And it's easy. Yeah, the programs that exist now that we have, we anticipate, despite not being revolutionary, they will at some point be challenged by that state authority that you brought up.
So speaking of that, and you kind of alluded just briefly to it, what have been some of the struggles that you all have faced in keeping things going?
The main struggle of our programs is just that they're not legitimized. It's a fairly new idea in the US and in the West. Mutual aid concepts are not taught in schools, or they're not very prevalent. So we have a fight of being legitimized. As you would see, when we did receive recognition or press from local media, you had several thousand people out there arguing about the same thing that Catherine brought up earlier is, how can you do this if it's not perfectly legal and the exact amount of millimeters away from the sidewalk? One of the reasons why we kind of try to avoid press is that reason. People can argue that's kind of productive, but it is something that can drown us, like I mentioned before, and can detract from our effort if we give credence to people arguing about legality, because we're about doing the right thing. We've kind of had ambition that there would be more free breakfast programs spurting out of this, which hasn't happened, and that's really our fault, no one else's. I wouldn't say that's a struggle, but we have like 3 or 4 simultaneous efforts going here, and always looking to expand and do what we can to actually fit the ideals of mutual aid.
And it occurs to me, I know that a lot of free breakfast programs in the past have been aimed mostly at school children. Do you get a good variety of people and ages, intergenerational experience, you might say, at your program?
Big time. Yes, all ages. We have a lot of children who go there for the community aspect. So there's a park where we serve breakfast, and it's a good place to grab some food. We also give away clothes and toys kind of on the side of a lot of those. So we get a lot of non-English speakers, a lot of Arabic speakers, Spanish speakers. We have a couple of us are somewhat bilingual, so we're able to bridge a gap that way. That was something we didn't anticipate, kind of foolishly going out there, that we would need to speak 3 languages, but it's diverse. It's just like the city of Des Moines as a whole. We get people from all walks of life, from all wealth groups, from the homeless to someone that appears to, have their own business and seems relatively stable. But we get everybody, and we attempt to help everybody unconditionally. That's kind of the mission. It's all comers, unconditional aid, take what you need. We're good. We'll be out here every other Saturday. That's basically the exchange, but it's positive. We get a lot of good feedback from not only our community leadership there, but I hate to call them customers, but the people that frequent the breakfast usually praise us on not being judgmental and offering unconditional aid, no doubt.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky piece, particularly for other organizations that are like food banks and those sorts of things. That I think particularly because they probably received some government grants or those sorts of things in order to operate, that then there's more requirements that they have to make sure that they kind of spread it as widely as possible. And so they have like, you can get this much per person or per family unit or whatever per month. And that's like a good, to give as many people as possible something. And then to have groups like North Des Moines Mutual Aid and other groups that can give a depth for folks whose need is greater in that moment. And so then they get to do that deeper stuff. But it is a tricky, how do you decide that? And it seems like you all have decided people need what they need.
We're kind of the antithesis of a food bank. That's honestly the goal. That's like an example of philanthropy and charity, where we're more about pooling our resources and providing unconditional aid no matter the circumstance. And that's one of those things that we honestly get prayed for. And that's something that food banks do that some of the people that are in need that access them complain about. So it's something that we do kind of to counter the food bank model, which is still kind of built around capitalist ideals. Our concept of mutual aid is based on the concept of, humanity evolving through cooperation and sharing resources rather than competing and holding basic human needs above people's heads because they may not meet such and such requirement. We don't believe in that. I'm very confident I speak for everybody who was saying that. We're trying to draw a distinction between mutual aid and philanthropy and charity with our work, for sure.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked about it, and I realized I should have said this at the beginning, but I think the concept of mutual aid is a new concept for a lot of people. And I don't know about our listeners, but I know at least some listeners probably haven't heard of it, aren't familiar with it. Can you say a little bit more about how you would define maybe or explain what exactly is mutual aid as opposed to philanthropy or charity or other things?
Yeah, no doubt. The difference is honestly a socialism versus capitalism thing. But I mean, mutual aid was a concept that was introduced by a Russian anarchist, Peter Kropotkin, that argued against social Darwinism and the theory of survival of the fittest and, alpha male and the cream of the crop rises to the top and owns the most stuff. He argued that humanity and evolution and technological advances that we've made as a society are the product of cooperation instead of competition. And it's the idea that we advanced by sharing resources rather than fighting over them. And it still holds up almost 100 years later. It's a way of explaining communism through a scientific lens rather than a political one. And it's basically counter social Darwinism is how I would define it.
It also sounds like it has a lot in common with harm reduction as concepts go, focusing on what reduces the harm rather than what is the most acceptable according to certain people's lives.
Absolutely true. Yep, definitely. Harm reduction is a focus. Anecdote there, we have obviously a houseless community that's attracted to the fringe. And so we have, varying degrees of stability of the people that are in need there. And sometimes that involves months worth of patience. Whereas that particular individual who's suffering out there was interacting with most of the people, and I apologize for the generalization there, they would have had the cops called on them the way that they're behaving. So instead of that, we're trying to meet them with unconditional support and meeting their immediate needs rather than reserving the judgment and assuming that the system that exists now will help them, which in my opinion is false. It's a false belief because it will not. Incarcerating someone like that is just going to make it worse. So, right, it's a harm reduction. The entire model is harm reduction. Everything we're doing is harm reduction. Absolutely. Good point.
And I think particularly given the origins of the North Des Moines Mutual Aid Group and the Community Fridge and your own participation and engagement with it, it makes a lot of sense to say it is not helping or serving anyone to call the police. The police, particularly in Des Moines, but throughout the history of policing, is not to help people. It is something that is violent, and police frequently cause harm. And in Des Moines, right, I think we're like number 6 of all of the cities in most excessive force uses by police. And so to say, okay, what does it actually, it's a decided argument for defunding the police, but what does it look like to actually provide the help that we are able to provide so that this person can get this part of stability and maybe build on that stability rather than saying you don't have this other part of stability and therefore we're not going to even give you the option of trying to find any of the other ones. We're just going to lock you up or say that whatever the case may be, but put you in a situation where you don't have that agency and you don't have that space to figure things out.
Yeah, we wouldn't exist. There would be no need for those programs if the existing system already addressed those issues, which it can. They're not doing it by choice. They have vastly more resources than we do. And we're not solving the problem, but we're taking a small sliver and addressing it and showing that it's possible. But with their laws and policies, they enforce the issues that we're trying to address. Houselessness, food insecurity, which are forms of violence, in my opinion. We can address that on a very, very, very small scale better than the Des Moines police can. No doubt in my mind. I say that confidently. When someone's problem is that they need a place to sleep or they need dinner, I guarantee you we'll help them better than the Des Moines police ever would.
And for those listening who don't live in Des Moines, I would point out, I don't live in Des Moines. I live a fair distance from the place. And I have no personal experience with the Des Moines police. But the experience I do have is having been in a profession that lost the trust of the American public in a fairly spectacular and public way, that is to say, the clergy. And we realized, and by we, I mean the group of clergy I was with at my seminary at the time, that in order to get the trust of the public back, we would have to earn it, which takes, work and effort. And also that we needed the trust of the general public in order to do our jobs. I have witnessed a lot of police departments across the country react to the police in general having lost the trust of the public. They did not react the same way. It takes work to keep the public trust, and it should. It's supposed to. You don't trust people if you don't have a reason to. And I wish that there would be more departments that would react with actively trying to gain trust and earn trust and deserve it, because I would be a lot more comfortable living in this country then.
That's somewhat of the elephant in the room I didn't bring up, is that we're not a nonprofit. We're definitely a political motivated organization. We hand out the Des Moines Defender zine, which is a propaganda magazine. We speak to our clients that come through in need, and we're directly motivated by the defund and abolish movement in Des Moines. So we're not doing electoralism, but all of us met behind that same ideal, and we still all believe in it. So yeah, we're definitely an anti-police group, and that's a slant that we put on the mutual aid. And throughout history, those type of abolitionist movements have typically been involved with free food programs and free medical programs and such. So we're just following in the footsteps of people that, they laid the carpet out a long time ago. We're just trying to do our best to emulate them.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of it, right? Is the reality is a lot of what is considered crime right now comes from a lack of resources and a lack of stability. So if we can actually, and that's a lot of how people have explained the arguments of what does it look like to defund police? Well, it means that all of that money that is going into policing can go into putting people in homes, to giving people houses, to giving people food, to providing for those needs so that they don't have to resort to stealing, or so that the other things that we've decided are crimes aren't happening. And the reality is also that, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit, Pete, a little bit ago, that there are levels of violence, right? The violence that we talk about by and large is the theft or those sorts of things. And then that can scale up to riots or that, and that can scale up to police reactions and escalation of those. But the basic level of violence that is operating that fuels all of that is economic inequality, is not giving people what they need to live. And that's part of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, is that every human being has a right to food, clean water, shelter, those sorts of things. Yeah. And so when we talk about that, like talking about both the layers of violence, and I will try and find a link that kind of explains those three levels of violence for folks, for our listeners, but that impacts it. And then also being able to address the underlying stuff to say, this is what defunding actually could look like.
Yeah,
makes
no
a
doubt.
big difference.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, what they're talking about is property violence, whereas someone like me would see crimes against people, houselessness, and food insecurity, which I see as systemic issues. I see those as state violence and not individual failures.
Yeah. Or why can't we address corporate crime like wage theft via refusing to let people take their breaks, or insisting that people work through their breaks? Why can't we take that as seriously as we take someone, looting during a riot?
Yeah.
It'll never happen. We have an unjust system. That's what we're railing against here.
Yeah.
The system's built on upholding those type of laws. So it's nothing we're going to be able to talk them out of believing in, unfortunately.
Yeah. And that's what capitalism, right? Capitalism's message is property destruction is violence.
Correct. Yes.
While the message of like humans is violence is a thing that happens against human beings, not against property. But because of capitalism, it gets all mixed up.
Yeah.
Agree 100%. Yep. Right on.
So, Pete, one of the things that we're trying to do in this series is to ask all of our guests if they have a favorite recipe that we can include. And then everyone who is a patron on Patreon for us will then have access to like our 5 recipes or whatever. So, do you have a favorite recipe?
I'm going to use this slot for a shameless plug in hopes of someone will start a free meal program in Des Moines. We have all of the quote unquote capital/hardware food warmers, tins, tables, tents for another group of 4 to 5 dedicated people to start a simultaneous free dinner, lunch, or breakfast program. And we're hoping to network with those people. So come see us. I do not have a recipe because cooking isn't my game. That's, me coming clean here representing a food group, but we want someone to bring their own beautiful breakfast recipes to us and use our equipment to provide for more communities in Des Moines. Sorry to hijack the segment, but that's what I had to say.
That's perfectly fair. And
Thank you.
as someone who values food safety, Pete, I would like to thank you for taking food safety seriously by not poisoning people. So
Always.
Yes, that is very good. So what do you do during the meals? What do you do? What's your role?
My personal role is flagging down cars and making sure people are comfortable coming in and seeing us. That's basically it. That's my active role at the breakfast. I actually do prepare the meat, the sausage and the bacon. So it's quite an operation in our tiny kitchen here. Probably about 25 pounds of, turkey bacon, turkey sausage, and then the pork stuff. So I'm scrambling around. I get up about 4 a.m. and put about 4 racks in at a time. So we cut it close, but we get it out there by about 8 a.m. Nice and hot. Despite claiming I'm not a cook, I am able to pull that off. So that's only a compliment.
There's a variety of different ways that people need food, and you are providing some of that food. And even if the recipe is in fact just put the strips of bacon on the pan and the pan in the oven or on the stove, that's an important recipe.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a vegetarian, so I'm not going to eat it, but they would eat it.
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for the positive reinforcement. That's it.
Yeah. I think sometimes we forget that there are simple things that can be recipes, right? Like I have right now a box of Triscuits next to me, but like cutting up a block of cheese and or an apple and eating it with Triscuits is in fact like a valid form of meal preparation. And I think sometimes we can get into the space of it has to be so fancy. And yeah, it's great when it is fancy, but also if all I have time or brain capacity for is to like put cheese with cracker and eat, that is food.
It occurs to me, I actually have something to plug here. There is an online cookbook, which I will endeavor to find the link to, that is called Eating for $4 a Day. And it is excellent for people who are low income or people who just don't have a lot of energy and time to put into their food. Personally speaking, having ADHD, I love fancy recipes. I love excellent food, but I don't functionally have the wherewithal to make most of those recipes. I have a couple fancy recipes that I have enough practice with I now can manage, but mostly my food has to be very simple. And it's an excellent cookbook. It will actually break things down to the point of, have you considered putting peanut butter on a piece of bread yet? Is that an option for you? And sometimes when you've lost your executive function, that can be super helpful. And I believe there's also a sequel to it, which I don't remember the name of, but I will try to find the links for those.
Yeah, that's brilliant. The like peanut butter on bread. Sometimes that is what I need of like, what is going on? I need food and I can't think.
That has probably saved my life. I learned the habit about 4 years ago when I was diagnosed with ADHD of keeping a jar of peanut butter next to my chair. And I can go get the bread, or I don't have to go get the bread. I can just have some peanut butter, but that will put my blood sugar back in a healthy place if I have forgotten to eat for several hours, which happens when you have ADHD. So
yeah, sometimes when I'm on call at the hospital, I know the emergency department has graham crackers and stuff that they can give people, but I know that there is a secret jar of peanut butter, particularly for staff, where as a chaplain, I get to sleep if I'm not being paged. But if I'm being paged all night, I'm using a lot more energy than I would for sleeping. And so I get really like where I can feel my blood sugar just like plummeting.
Yeah.
And so then I can take a spoon, there's plastic spoons and stuff. So take a scoop of peanut butter and a package of graham crackers and have peanut butter and graham crackers. And that is enough to like keep me going to do my job.
Food is important and we should give it to people.
In abundance.
Absolutely.
Abundance. Every time we say abundance, I'm just going to repeat it to make sure everybody gets the pun.
Emily feels like there aren't enough food puns in this series yet. And so by golly, we're just going to make the most out of them.
I know. I realized that I didn't make a list of all of the bread and food puns that I possibly could to sneak in at all times. So I have to, in the intermediary, just emphasize the ones that already exist.
Yeah.
Anyway, as we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is from 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 through 44. God orders Elisha to feed 100 people with enough food for maybe 20. Elisha's servant worries at first, but when he does as God instructs, there is plenty for everyone. So one of the obvious themes in this is feeding, providing food for a crowd of people. And it looks really different now, in particular, given the pandemic, given protests, given community meals. There are different ways to look at feeding. And it's been interesting to me to see how feeding people happens, because Well, in a pandemic, one of the first things we were told was don't eat in groups because you can't wear a mask. And so also simultaneously, at every protest I have ever been to, there has been some version of food and water given to people so that they can, because it takes a lot of energy to be intimidated by police, but it also just takes a lot of energy to protest. And so there is this space where we had to kind of figure out, like, how are people doing it? And sometimes it's granola bars that people show up with, granola bars. And so there's granola bars and water bottles, or there's hot food that, like, there's a line and you kind of go through it and there's set servers, or there's food trucks. So it looks like a bunch of different things, but that's been one of the gifts that I've noticed in the protests is there's this commitment to, when we gather, we will make sure that people have the sustenance they need for this work. Yes. I think that is a beautiful approach to it.
And it makes things more accessible too for, say, diabetics and people who are hypoglycemic and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. As we dive into the verses, in verse 43 at the beginning, we read, "But Elisha's servant said, 'How can I set this before 100 people?'" And the way I read it is like, what's going to happen when 100 people see food for 20 and know that there's not enough? And if it had been on, like, the show Battlestar Galactica, this happened where there was a bunch of food and Gaius in his, like, cult group had been gone and came back and realized that there was all of this food that they had been storing up from a time when they had struggled to get enough of the food rations and stuff. And so he was like, no, we need to share this food with people. We can't hoard this food. And everybody else is like, this is not going to end well. And they are in fact right that when they start to share the food, there's the propensity for a riot. And there's also these mob people with guns who then take that food by force. And so there's just this dynamic of, how do we set such a small amount before 100 people? And how do we expect that to actually not cause a riot? Yeah.
That's a tricky one. I mean, there are lots of examples, obviously, within capital where that does happen with the myth of scarcity. The saddest thing about capitalism, though, is that the system produces more than enough food to feed everybody 2 times over, but we prefer to throw it away because it's not profitable to feed everybody. So it's an interesting passage. So that predates capitalism, I assume, but it is kind of like a peek into the future about what will probably happen if we keep the system we have now and scarcity becomes more and more real. But as it stands now, we throw away more than enough food to feed people that are hungry in the world. We could fix it, but choose not to because it's not profitable.
Yep. Yeah. Making choices based on what is profitable.
Right. I disagree with that, but that's how the world works.
Yeah.
Yep.
Doesn't seem
and
like
it doesn't actually profit anyone.
Right. It does, a few people, but that seems like that. Being a guy that doesn't know anything about theology, that seems like that passage is written by a time traveler. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. In verse 44, we read, "He set it before them, they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord." So this verse reminds me of a comment that I heard from a clergy colleague, and this was several years ago, so I have forgotten who that clergy colleague was. If you recognize this story and you're listening and you know that this was you, please tell me. My colleague knew someone who was trying to figure out, how did the miracle stories get into the Bible if miracles aren't actually true and never actually happened? If you're going to assume that God isn't real, how did those miracle stories come to be and start being passed around? And the theory for several of the feeding miracles, like this and the one about Jesus that we'll hear in a minute, was that the people asking to be fed would have probably had some food with them, maybe not a huge amount, but they knew that they were going traveling, so they might have brought some food with them. But they didn't want anyone to know that they had this food because they knew it wasn't really enough to share. And so when a smaller amount of food was set before them, they could take a little piece of that and then slowly eat it while also clandestinely eating their own food. And that way there would be enough for everybody. And the idea is there was always enough for everybody. It's just we didn't know at first.
That reminds me of what happens a lot at protests, where it might be even that you have enough extra for one other person, but not for, 100 other people, right?
Sure.
And so that's like at protests where I would grab a handful of granola bars and put them in my bag and take them and contribute them, and other people would contribute their granola bars and other people their granola bars. And so in that way, there is that space of maybe they take a little bit of what is given, but also maybe it's, okay, now I feel secure enough that I can share this more broadly, that I brought more than enough, but I didn't bring enough for everybody. So I'll share with the people around me and they'll share with the people around them. And
Sure.
then it kind of becomes bigger.
And that reminds me of a popular children's book called Stone Soup, which, if you aren't familiar with it, it's a book about a village that lacks food and they are hungry. And so some strangers come in and put a stone in the bottom of a pot and fill it with water and say that they're going to make stone soup. And then they sort of invite the people in town to bring, just a few pinches of salt, or, this could use one onion. Doesn't anybody have one onion? Or, and so forth. And then they fill up the pot with all the food, and then they have soup. And they don't actually have to eat the rock, which is the tricky part. The idea of people actually had enough food all along, they just didn't realize it. That sort of reminds me as a very stealthy sort of sleight of hand version of stone soup. And now I want the version of the Bible where the miracle workers were actually stage magicians and doing sleight of hand all over the place. So that would be fun.
That's fantastic.
And as a closing comment, the pastor who passed the story along to me said that they thought that that version of the story sounded just as much like a miracle as the miracle version of the story. It's just a different kind of miracle because this is people being willing to share with each other.
Yeah, which does feel like a miracle, especially in capitalism.
Yeah.
It directly ties into our concept too in the modern context of pooling resources rather than relying on donations from, capitalists who are using it for PR purposes. Even though we admittedly do that we take grocery overflow. The idea that our members pool our resources is a key concept of mutual aid, which I appreciate you sharing that passage. Again, that ties directly into the context of what we do, no doubt.
Yeah. Versus like when you go shopping at Walmart and they ask, do you want to donate $1 to children's whatever? And actually what they're looking for is a tax write-off.
Yeah, the Walton family could write a check that would eliminate poverty in the United States right now and wouldn't even feel the pinch. So yeah, corporate charity, corporate welfare it's just another version of public relations for them. They use it as a PR spin.
Yeah. I also love the book Stone Soup. I have used it as a children's sermon before, and it's fantastic. I love the sneakiness of, it just needs a little bit of this, just a little of this.
Yeah.
But it does. Yeah, it does feel like a miracle to get in the context of being so distracted and disjointed and separated and isolated. It does feel like a miracle to be like, we can come together. And that's a lot of what protesting feels like, right? It feels like a miracle of people saying, I'm showing up for this because the injustice that is harming you is harmful to the community. It is the harm that is caused to you is not okay. And I'm going to show up for that, even though I am not a direct recipient of the harm.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not just a matter of something that you can do with money or something you can do with food or that. It's also a decent chunk of my job is volunteer management. And the number of things that I have had congregations absolutely convinced they could never do. But if you trick them into it by just saying, I just need someone to do this one tiny little piece, they can do amazing things. It's just break it down into the small pieces and it seems so much more manageable.
Definitely. Yeah. If you told me 2 years ago that 5 of my closest friends and I were running a free breakfast program in the River Bend neighborhood, I would have thought it was nuts and impossible. So it's definitely true. And it's a lot easier than you think. Once you start branching out horizontally, talking to your like-minded friends, it's amazingly easily. I mean, I've talked about it before. It really involves, calling your buddy on Thursday and saying, hey, do you want to go make the pickup today or should I? And we all know our role and it's just 5 or 6 of us. So it's definitely possible. People will doubt it though, like Catherine said. It looks hard. I would have thought the same thing though, like I said 2 years ago, but it's not true.
Yeah.
Our second reading for this episode is from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 14 through 21. The author prays that we may be strengthened by the Holy Spirit and that Christ may live in our hearts so that we can better understand God's inexplicable and relentless love for us.
So one of the themes for this passage is the idea of rooting ourselves in love, and that when we root ourselves in love, it has the capacity to break cycles of harm. And so Susanna, who's a friend of the podcast, actually was talking to me about this the other day when I was preparing for the podcast, and was talking about how that is connected to the Matrix, and that in the Matrix, Neo finally gets to the place where he gets all of the information and he finds out that, in fact, there have been Neos before him that have come along again and again and again, and they've always made the deal to let whoever it is, Matrixy people, win, to take a small group of people and start a human colony with that small group of people and let that grow. And they always just come and cycle back to this place. But in the Matrix, Trinity is still in the Matrix when this happens. And it's made clear that anybody in the Matrix dies. And so because of the love that Neo has for Trinity, he breaks that chain. He breaks that cycle of exploitation and all of that to create a whole different way of being for the people in that situation. And I think that is this beautiful example of like, when you have more information, you can make decisions, but when you're rooting your decisions in love, it might not match up with the other decisions that you would have made if you're just thinking about them, which I love. And I particularly love as a trans person thinking about the Matrix movies, and that the makers of the Matrix movies have come out as trans and have named the movies as trans allegories. And the idea that like, when I get to the place where I can love who I am and who I'm called to be, for me as a Christian, who God is continually recreating and creating me to be, the cycles that I have been stuck in change and shift, and I get to be more fully me, and therefore I get to engage with the world in a different way, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And then as we dive into the verses in that passage, in verse 18, we read, I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth. And I can't help but thinking of that expansiveness as outer space, right? And what is the breadth and length and height and depth of the background cosmic radiation, which even that is a limited thing, because wherever we are in the universe, we have that same kind of area of background radiation. And so they're like overlapping balls of background radiation, and we don't actually know how big this expanding universe is. I love that thought of like, how do we comprehend the cosmic background radiation and the expansiveness of space? And spoiler, it's not by letting billionaires race into space. I'm all for outer space expansion, and also think we should tax billionaires a whole bunch of money, because they don't actually deserve to be billionaires, because billionaires only exist through exploitation. But outer space is awesome, and I'm a fan of continuing that exploration because it makes us wonder and it makes us imagine things. And that, I think, has a gift for us.
Yeah.
It's my outer space commercial for the day.
I'm impressed that we are on a Bread of Life kick, and you have reference to outer space, but not Limbus yet in this episode.
I know.
I'm sure we'll get there.
Actually, we don't get there because I got there on a different episode. I didn't want to reference Limbus bread every episode.
Ooh.
That seems excessive.
So you're alternating it with outer space. That's what I'm hearing. In verse 20, we read, by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine. Abundance. It's almost like we named this episode that for a reason. And if you have never seen a dancing bun before, back in ye olden days of movie theaters, some of them used to play a little jingle that were trying to get you to go out to the concession stand and buy snacks. And often this involved a cartoon of a dancing hot dog with bun and a popcorn bag and a cup of pop that were also dancing with them. And we will link to a picture of the cartoon that I grew up with, at least that version. And this was also very popular at drive-in movies. And the movie concession stand was definitely a example of abundance from my childhood, that not necessarily abundance that I was able to have access to because my parents had rules about that sort of thing, but some access. So
yeah, definitely the capitalist, really expensive kind of thing, but the abundance, the movie theater popcorn is the best example of that for me. There's just always so much popcorn.
Yeah.
I'll make a mutual aid anecdote. It feels really, really good when you can tell somebody that you have more than enough for everybody. You know, think about it back when you were a kid, you know, when you're with your family and there's tons of food, it just feels good. When people come up, they're often hesitant when they're taking things from the fridge or breakfast because they assume there's some type of limitation on it. But it feels really good to tell them, no, go ahead and tell how many do you need? Asking that question, it makes it feel good. Do it more with more things. It's amazing. There is plenty of abundance. There's plenty of food for everybody. We can solve that problem, at least for now.
Yeah. I think that's a huge piece of it, is like the just naming the reality that is true on a cosmic scale and a global scale. There is enough for everyone, and is true in this particular like corner of it where there is enough in this fridge, in this meal program for everyone.
And it doesn't have to be commoditized. it doesn't have to be sold for profit by a capitalist that employs people that produce and distribute the food either. Admittedly, we're relying on capitalist supply chains, but on our very, very small scale, you can distribute food without a for-profit motive. It's definitely true. And it's, we know with economies of scale, that's something that you could duplicate even wider and larger.
Yeah, for sure. And if we abolish capitalism, then there actually will just always be food for everyone. So there's it's tied into capitalism, but also when capitalism ultimately fails, there will be a whole other system that will actually provide the food. And so it will still be true.
I hope
there will always be enough. That's the goal.
Right.
Yeah. Our gospel reading for this episode is John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. Jesus works with the disciples to feed a large crowd with a little food from a child. Then Jesus retreats by himself, and the disciples take a boat to Capernaum in an effort to escape the crowd. When a storm arises, Jesus shows up and calms it. So one of the themes for this is the ideas of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So for those who are not familiar, there's the psychological concept of a pyramid, where in order to not just survive, but live and thrive and reach some sort of it's not enlightenment, but it's a
state of contentment and happiness.
Yeah, in order to reach that, you have to have certain things met. And the very basic, very bottom of the pyramid is physiological needs. So that includes air, water, food, shelter, sleep, depending on kind of which pyramid you do. We'll link to a Wikipedia article about this, but Jesus definitely goes for food and sleep, right? Everybody needs food. And then there's and now we need rest, because rest is important, especially for those of us who are introverts in groups of thousands of people. But so I love this space of Jesus, okay, let's establish Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Are we getting the physiological things met? And it reminded me of the Hunger Games in District 11. I mean, most of the districts have this in some capacity, but District 11 in particular really doesn't have either rest or food during harvest, right? Because they are harvesting the whole time, so they don't get very much rest. And then while they do technically have food, the food that they get goes to the harvest. And so they don't get to keep any of the food. And there's really high penalties if they do try and keep it. So they don't have the access to good food, even though other districts think that they would, because they're the ones that harvest all the food. But that space where they don't have the capacity to do other things that are more life-giving, they certainly don't have the capacity to resist the violence of the capital, because they're stuck in this space of not having what they need physiologically.
Yeah. In verse 10, we read, Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." I have to say that I immediately flash back to every single worship service I've ever led where I gesture to the people, okay, it's time to sit down now. Probably after this gospel reading is read, I will do exactly that. And I don't find it all that difficult during services on Sunday mornings, because most people like to sit down by that point. In fact, I've had people complain that I have them stand up too much. And
I always have a difficulty as pulpit supply of knowing when. In each congregation you're supposed to stand up or sit down, because some congregations don't have it in the bulletin, and everybody has different practices. And so I'm like, I don't know, you tell me. And nobody ever does. And so I'm like, with hand gestures that are not visible on podcasts.
Right. And also in this particular case, in this gospel story, the disciples were saying, sit down so you can eat. And generally speaking, I imagine that probably wasn't too hard for them to get people to sit down either, because when in doubt, bribe people with food and they will become more agreeable. I find this to be accurate in most of my life. The reference that came to mind for me was from an episode of West Wing called Somebody's Going to Emergency, when Toby Ziegler is supposed to be talking to this group of protesters, and the guy running the protest, or the guy who claims to be running the protest, whether or not he has any control is entirely a different question, has a much harder time getting people to sit down or at least be quiet enough to have a conversation, because they are not very organized and not very focused on actually getting done the things that they want to get done. And so Toby winds up giving them a speech on how to protest. And if you're going to protest, you need to have a plan. And so the message I took from that is that when in doubt, listen to Toby, because Toby knows what he's doing.
That is true. Toby is a brilliantly political person. And I think that space of, okay, Toby is there to talk to people who are upset about a free trade agreement. And I have my own concerns about free trade agreements. And Toby has his reasons why free trade agreements are good in the immediate present of they stop wars. there's bigger issues that they don't address and that they can exacerbate. But there is this space of Toby being like, okay, I will give you the 101. I will help you do this better so that you can protest us better. And I think there's a sense in which that's my favorite way of having people who are elected officials is let me help you push me better so that, it gives them more cover, right, to do what they want to be done, to know that people care about it. But it also helps us who are activists and organizers to do that better and more effectively, to make change so that things become more just. And that, I think, is part of Toby's secret agenda there is like, yeah, y'all should be upset and you should want to change, but you have to do it intentionally.
Yeah.
You can't just shout and yell into the void and expect things to change.
Yeah.
And then in verse 12, I just realized we both went definitely for the feeding part and completely ignored the Jesus walking on water and how Jesus walks.
We had a storm story
3 to 4
like 3 weeks
miles.
ago.
I know, but Jesus walks 3 to 4. They're 3 to 4 miles out offshore. Jesus shows up, and then all of a sudden they're at their destination. It's a little bit timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
Yeah, Jesus multiplies the amount of food here by 5,000. So I don't know that complaining about the timeline is really the world's greatest.
I mean, true, fine. But it's not like they're in the TARDIS, so I'm just saying.
You don't know that.
Well, it's
the biblical
true.
authors probably had to leave some things out.
I mean, yeah, but like, how do you get a boat in the TARDIS? I'm just saying. It'd be a little tricky.
I mean, we know about one
the
of the TARDIS's doors. We don't claim that that's the only set of doors.
True.
It's not a false binary.
Fine, take my usual line. I know it is. Anyway, in verse 12, we read, when the crowd was satisfied, Jesus told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. And this reminds me of food rescue, which friends of mine do, and we've kind of talked about, but also gleaning. So gleaning is a biblical practice where people who owned farms and stuff would go through at harvest time. They would go through once and they wouldn't go back and catch all that was left over so that other people who didn't have resources, who didn't have enough, usually like orphans, widows, that sort of category of people, could go through and collect what was left over. And so it was kind of a built-in place of holding space for people who might otherwise fall through the cracks. And I love that. And I love the ways that that happens today, where sometimes it happens with community gardens and stuff, but it also happens with food rescue, right? Where there's food that might have a sell-by date that's coming towards the end or that sort of a thing. And so then it's, how do we make use of food that is currently still good without then just, I think grocery stores would otherwise just throw away? And how do we navigate that so that nothing may be lost?
Yeah,
it's definitely possible. Yeah, we'd have to do away with the commoditizing food, but it's definitely possible. I think I had mentioned before that we have that issue with mutual aid where we will have to insist that we do not accept expired food because we don't want to be serving our human beings who are just as qualified to have clean food as you or I are. We don't want expired food. So that is a small little dilemma that we face too, just on the ground on a small scale.
Yeah. And I think there is an important distinction between expired food and food that's like best by dates, or even I think about, so I get notifications a lot of time because my friend does food rescue and because sometimes she has food for me and I get notifications from different community fridges. And so she said like bananas, for example, frequently there are bananas that are just like beyond the place where somebody's going to eat them, or they get too bruised or whatever. And so she'll get tons and tons of bananas, and it's not something she's going to put in the fridge because it's not something that you want to offer people, because people deserve, like you said, Pete, good food, but it's great bananas for smoothies or banana bread or those sorts of things. And so then I can collect them and have them, and they become good food for me in a different way. Or I can make banana bread with them and bring the banana bread to the community fridge or the community spaces. And so those are the like different places where it's like, okay, how do we use it to the greatest extent possible, all of the things? And also, how do we make sure that if we're getting stuff that's close to the expiration date, we can cook it and provide that as food for people, or we can do other things for it? And when does it need to be compost?
Right.
Yeah. Because that's also real.
I guarantee you too, there's such a need, speaking for the Merle Hay neighborhood, for food that we put breakfast that we don't give away, in River Bend, we put them in the fridge and they're gone within 45 minutes. And no complaints yet. I do acknowledge food safety and we take it very seriously. But yeah, you're correct. You can get resourceful with all types of food items. My mother would be proud listening to me say that. You can create meals out of almost nothing. And it's definitely true. I agree.
Yeah.
I know that as a non-cook.
So Pete, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Yeah. Again, thank you too for having me on. It's been a pleasure to meet and learn from both of you. This has been very enlightening. I appreciate that. I wanted to do a shameless plug and give a shout out. I wanted to shout out my favorite Catholic worker, Jessica Reznicek, who has unfortunately been sentenced to prison for her brave and heroic acts, trying to defend the human species from climate change. I've met her a few times. I'm sure she has no idea who I am, but it was always an honor. And I'm proud that someone like that came from our community. And I think it's a travesty what has happened to her. And I will write you letters. There's a new Des Moines Defender out Monday.
Before you get to that,
yeah, fair,
sorry,
go ahead.
I just want to for those who are unfamiliar with what happened with Jessica, she's a water protector who was arrested for taking apart part of one of the pipelines, and so was arrested. And generally the plea deals that get worked out are a couple years. And once they had worked out the plea deal for what she would plead guilty to, the government then went in and raised the stakes on it by calling it terrorism. And so this is part of the tricky space that the government is now making attacks on oil terrorism. And we've seen that in Iowa, they changed the penalties for certain types of protest and each of these things to raise the stakes to make it harder to resist this. And so Jessica has sentenced to, I think, 8 years, but it's this such investment on the capitalism that is causing climate change of the oil and gas industry and the ability to exploit the earth in that way that then causes harm. But we've decided that the things that count legally as terrorism include attacks against capitalism. It's in the thing that says capitalism is the United States. And that is so frustrating every time I think of it. I'm just how? Yeah.
They definitely threw the book at her, trying to discourage, what was her call to action. I vividly remember that when she got arrested in front of the utilities board a few years ago. That was the call to action, to try to inspire other people to do that. And during sentencing, they definitely heard her say that and came down with the extreme. And I will mention the irony here is I believe that less than 5 days before she was sentenced, a huge national story came out about Des Moines having an extreme shortage of clean water, which, not because of the DAPL pipeline, because of nitrate, but it all blends into the same thing. As she argued back then, water is life, and she's, paying for the sins of all climate activists out there for us all. So it's
and she's not paying for the sins of climate activists. She's paying for the sins of corporations. And
not true. My bad.
Yeah,
you're totally right. Yeah, thank you for correcting me. She's paying for the sins of humanity and multinational oil corporations, no doubt.
Yeah, which impacts, as I think, I don't know if you said it in here when we were talking before, but impacts food sustainability. If we don't have clean water, if we don't have access to clean water and clean, healthy land and soil, we can't grow good food and we can't feed people.
I'm pretty sure that tar sand that's pumped through that pipeline that she allegedly damaged wastes hundreds of millions of gallons of fresh water just in the processing of that. That tar sand is essentially sludge that they have to process into oil that we can use. So I don't know much about that type of stuff, but from what I understand, it's nasty anyway. You twist it. It's poisoning the air and the water. And she was the hero to do something about it.
Yeah.
I brought that up specifically because I am the editor of the Des Moines Defender zine. There's a new one, a special double summer issue coming out on Monday that features a essay about Reznicek and her direct action that we spent a lot of time on and we're proud of. I hope she sees it.
That'll be when this episode comes out. So it'll be today.
Beautiful. The same day. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. You want to pick that up, you can find it on Twitter page at DSM Defender. You can pick it up at Lifestyle Juices on University in the Drake neighborhood. And lastly, just plugging North Des Moines Mutual Aid and the Community Fridge free breakfast program. If you're interested, come out and see us at Edna Griffin Park every other Saturday. Follow North Des Moines Mutual Aid on Twitter and donate if you can to $North DSM Mutual Aid. And again, I appreciate the platform and the knowledge.
Thank you. We're so glad to have had you.
Likewise.
Yeah, this is great.
Thank you.
We'll make sure we include these links for folks, both when we let them know about the episode on Tuesday, the day after it officially comes out. And in our episode description, we'll make sure we link to that stuff.
I appreciate it. Yeah, no, I seriously learned a lot. I was drawing analogies in my head to scripture. I haven't done that in a while. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's a lot of correlation, no doubt.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 10th Sunday after Pentecost with our special guest, Micah Luwaji. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want to access our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. And during our Jesus Loafs You series, you will also be able to find the recipes that our guests suggest on our Patreon as well.
Mm-hmm. Join at any level and you can have access to those recipes.
Yep. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.
Pax vobiscum.